Hello everyone. Good afternoon from Caracas. For Telesur, I'm Cody Weddle here in Caracas. Thanks for joining us on From the South. To begin, more than 151,000 people have been killed in Mexico from December 2006 to August of this year. 27,000 more remain disappeared. Now, all of this, according to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zeid Ra'ad al-Hussein, who visited the country on Wednesday. Now, al-Hussein condemned the 98% impunity rate in the North American country. The UN official calls on the government to accept criticism and to take steps to deal with what he called a very grave crisis of human rights. The human rights defender met with Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto and asked for him to gradually remove military forces from public safety operations.
Many of the issues raised by my predecessor 4 years ago remain of concern, and many of the people I have spoken to painted a very bleak and consistent picture of a society that is racked by high levels of insecurity, disappearances and killings, continuing harassment of human rights defenders and journalists, violence against women, and terrible abuses of migrants and refugees transiting the country on their way to the United States.
Now to our correspondent in Mexico, Clayton Kahn, who has more on the crisis of human rights in Mexico, where torture and enforced disappearances are often common practice.
After 3 days of meetings with officials and rights groups, UN Rights Commissioner Zeid Ra'ad al-Hussein gave his critical report on Mexico's human rights.
And many of the people I have spoken to painted a very bleak and consistent picture of a society that is racked by high levels of insecurity, disappearances and killings, continuing harassment of human rights defenders and journalists, violence against women, and terrible abuses of migrants and refugees.
Meanwhile, the official reaction to damning reports by international organizations has been to internally refute them, while at the same time applauding legislative measures that are a result of international pressure that at least rhetorically defend human rights and champion a transparent and responsible government.
At times we forget, we omit and let it pass, because at times our memory is short. But if we try to visualize Mexico 30 years ago, 20 years ago, we were a government authentically closed.
Yet, human rights defenders say that it is in fact the lack of transparency and impunity that continues to be a root cause of Mexico's human rights crisis, pointing to inaccurate data and statistics and opaque information gathered by the authorities.
I believe the problem crosses into issues of transparency, secrecy inside the local public prosecutor's offices, secrecy inside the Attorney General's office, secrecy by local courts, which impedes those of us worried about structural issues, even though we have a clear idea of what we are living here in Mexico.
Ultimately, civil society rights defenders argue that a militarization policy of Mexico's so-called war on drugs and systemic corruption sustain the human rights crisis. They also say that while there may be a degree of political legislative will to tackle the crisis, there's a complete lack of will to put these measures into practice. Clayton Kahn, Telesur, Mexico City.
We go to South America now. That's where the Brazilian Federal Accounts Court has ruled that the government's accounting practices in 2014 were illegal and should be rejected. Now, this is a new setback for President Dilma Rousseff, whose popularity is the lowest for a Brazilian president in more than 20 years. According to the court, her government's practices included taking what amounted to unauthorized loans from state-owned banks to make up for budget shortfalls. The court's ruling will now go to Congress and comes on top of another ruling by the Electoral Court on late Tuesday, which ordered a probe into alleged irregularities in Rousseff's 2014 re-election campaign. This could lead to the annulment of Rousseff's victory and hence possibly new elections.
Nations fail when institutions fail to fulfill their functions. We fulfill our mission in a technical and transparent manner in search of a better future for the country.
And meanwhile, the country's conservative opposition continues its attempts to use the low approval ratings of Rousseff's government to call for her impeachment. Our correspondent in Brazil now takes a look at the political opposition struggle there for power.
Brazil's conservative opposition has now made 5 requests to impeach President Dilma Rousseff.
None of these requests has any legal basis. In fact, they are trying to manipulate aspects of the constitution to bring down a president who was elected whether or not you like her government. What's happening in the Congress is a coup attempt, which will be defeated because he has no legal support and it's immoral.
Faced with the threat of a parliamentary coup, Rousseff reshaped her cabinet, giving more space to the PMDB. This extortion by the government's so-called allies means the centre-right PMDB increased its number of ministers from 6 to 7, while Rousseff's Workers' Party lost 3. However, the Speaker of the lower house and leading opponent of the government, Eduardo Cunha, is himself from the PMDB and has just been accused of corruption in Switzerland.
The PMDB is the biggest party in Congress, and this is reflected in the number of ministries it negotiated. They should strengthen the government's support in the Congress and in short term help to calm the political situation.
Facing possible imprisonment, Cunha leads the Congress that has been questioning the Dilma government's accounts.
The President of the House of Deputies presents himself as a pillar of virtue and respectability and tries to manipulate public opinion. But in fact, he's under investigation for corruption. So bit by bit, the enemies are being unmasked.
It's a major paradox. But these are the people seeking to bring down the government and overturn the choice of millions of Brazilians in last year's presidential election.
Moving on, the 42nd cycle of peace talks between the FARC and the Colombian government will end today in Havana, Cuba. And we're expecting an announcement. Our correspondent in Colombia now, Natalia Margarita, with more on that information and this announcement. As I was saying there, what is this announcement? What can we expect, Natalia?
Well, Cody, we still need to hear the announcement. The announcement is still yet to come, as you said. But what it's being talked about, it's been said here in Colombia, is that this announcement will be regarding the issue of victims, specifically victims of forced disappearance. Let's remember that here in Colombia, we have something like 45,000 forced disappeared civilians. And what I want to tell you right now is that in the place where I am, a demonstration of the Patriotic Union is taking place. And what this has to do with this announcement? Well, it has to do that many of these people that you see here right behind me, their relatives were forcibly disappeared during the 80s. The Patriotic Union Party was a party that during those 80s, during the late 80s, were victims of political violence, a political violence that left something between 3,000 and 4,000 members of this leftist political party dead, and many other more disappeared. So right what the survivors and the children, the relatives of these victims of the Patriotic Union are saying now is that they welcome the previous agreement that was reached on the issue of justice and victims, and that they hope that this will be the opportunity for them to know the truth, to know what happened to these members of the Patriotic Union, and also to find out the whereabouts of those that have disappeared since the late 80s, Cody.
Can you tell us about that march, Natalia? We're seeing them there behind you. Tell us more about sort of why they've gathered there today. I'm assuming it's sort of coinciding with the peace talks and with the end of the latest round. Tell us more about what they're telling you there. The 11th of October of 1987, it
was a very important and symbolic day for them, Cody, because that day their presidential candidate Jaime Pardo Leal was assassinated, was murdered by state agents and paramilitaries in general. All these people, their relatives that were assassinated, were victims of a state of violence from the state and from paramilitaries. So that's what they are holding this march. Well, today is the 8th of October, not the 11th, just due to logistic, they decide to hold it today. But the special date is this 11th of October, where their presidential candidate back in 1987 was assassinated, as I told you before. And regarding the peace process, they have been constantly supporting the peace process. They believe this is very important to clarify also, Cody, and is that them themselves, the Patriotic Union, is the product of a peace process back in the 80s. They are the product of a peace process between the back then President Belisario Betancourt and the FARC also. And after they create this party, this Patriotic Union Party, as a result of this peace process, they start being systematically assassinated. So they are saying that they don't want this to happen again, that they want that with this current peace process with the FARC and the government of President Juan Manuel Santos, the guarantees of political participation become a reality, so that we in Colombia don't experience ever again this systematic political violence against leftist parties and social movements, Cody.
All right, Natalia Margarita joining us in front of that march there in Bogota, Colombia, the capital of Colombia. Natalia, thanks so much.
Back to you, Cody.
And we go back to South America now. We head to Argentina, where the presidential candidate, Daniel Scioli, had a special companion on Wednesday. Former president of Uruguay, José Mujica, was with him during a visit to an agricultural school in the Buenos Aires municipality of Bavio to celebrate its 40th anniversary. Now, Pepe Mujica joins other regional leaders who have supported Scioli's candidature in the last weeks, such as Brazilian former President Lula da Silva and Bolivian President Evo Morales.
You have a privileged country. Take care of it. Being so privileged, you guys are used to fight among yourselves. What you need is to love yourselves, to love your Argentines, and to love each other is to respect each other. It does not mean that everybody has the same ideas, because that's impossible. To all agree, we didn't need a republic.
And a recent report by the National Institute Against Discrimination in Argentina shows that despite the government's efforts, discrimination there remains alive in the society. From Buenos Aires now, our correspondent Laureano Ponce with the details.
Despite having a European immigrant tradition, discrimination is far from being eradicated of Argentina. A recent survey shows that 41% of the people believe that immigrants take jobs away from Argentinians. However, reality seems very different for people like Paula, who came to Buenos Aires from Chile 6 years ago and has found several obstacles to find a job.
Only one of my classmates in college has found a job, and they are all immigrant and professionals. The rest of us have not been able to find a job related to our career. We are often hired as cheap labor, and that is not happening only here in Argentina. It happens in several countries.
The report was put together by the National Institute Against Discrimination and counted on the cooperation of 27 universities. It has revealed that 65% of the consulted people have experienced some form of discrimination, with social and economic inequalities being the underlying theme.
Socioeconomic levels remains the main discriminatory pretext, and that relates to the immigrants, the look, the skin color. All those aspects form a stereotype. There are models that have been built historically, and when someone cannot be framed in these models, they are excluded. This is why we say that a non-discriminating model is a model aimed at more inclusion.
Despite the creation of the National Institute Against Discrimination in 1995 and the National Plan Against Discrimination launched by former President Néstor Kirchner in 2005, the authorities believe that putting an end to discrimination cannot be achieved exclusively throughout legislation.
One of our biggest challenges is giving value to our differences, to the different identities, the different roots, to look beyond our ethnic, physical, or intellectual features, and try to find the best in us in those differences, because in those differences lies our social heritage.
The study shows that putting an end to discrimination is a long-term duty that requires fighting all forms of social, economic, and racial inequality in order to build a multicultural society. Laureano Ponce, Telesur, Buenos Aires.
To Central America now, tension is on the rise in Nicaragua after a police officer was killed in an ongoing dispute over union labor. The workers have kept a Canadian gold mine closed now for over a week and attacked the police when they were trying to remove them. 23 other officials and 8 civilians were also injured. Now, the workers believe that the company wants to replace permanent workers with temporary ones. They warned they will continue their struggle until the end. And rescue efforts continue in the Guatemalan community of El Cambre after last week's mudslide. Now, we now know at least 180 are dead after that disaster. Many of the rescue workers now say they are concerned about sanitary conditions.
Most of all, we think of the children and the elderly, who really could not expect what was going to happen that night. Then, it really shocks. It shocks and hurts a lot to see what's going on inside.
This moment, we're also working to get a dose to prevent any kind of infection by hepatitis.
Peruvian authorities have recovered the body of a Polish speleologist who died in a cave accident last month. Piotr Rutkowski was exploring the Chilcos Valley when he fell down a 50-meter cave. Now, authorities believe he died instantly. The caver's body was taken to the morgue for examination. Rescuers say the operation was risky due to the altitude. A plague is affecting the forests of Honduras. Now, despite the authorities' efforts to reduce its impacts, the plague has already expanded to the east and center of the country.
A pine beetle plague has started to spread throughout the Honduras forest, made up especially of pines.
The Honduras pine forest is being attacked by a pine beetle known scientifically as Dendroctonus frontalis. This plague is actually endemic to all pine forests, but when it finds conditions of weakness in the forest due to density, lightning, or fire, then it goes from endemic to epidemic, and at this moment it has affected 12,000 hectares of pine forest in Honduras.
The plague is expected to affect 150,000 hectares of forest, and authorities are coordinating efforts to control the impact and try to reduce it.
Currently, an interinstitutional committee has been created, and there are 160 brigades of plague control throughout the country.
So far, we have 100 officials, or troopers, who are working cutting the affected trees in order to prevent the bug to pass on to a healthy forest. We are working with the Forest Institute and with the troops to prevent any damage or accident among the members of the troop.
The brigades are working non-stop because the spread of this plague has increased in the last weeks. If the efforts don't come effective, an important portion of Honduras forest is in danger. Gerardo Torres, Telesur, Central America.
The 2015 Nobel Prize for Literature has been awarded. We'll have more on who exactly received, there's a hint, this important world distinction when we come back.
The truth behind the power. We lift the lid on some of the world's most ruthless figures. Open file. Only on telesurtv.net in English. Wherever the news, you'll be there. An insight into Africa today with Bill Fletcher.
The Global African, only on telesurtv.net in English. Wherever the news, you'll be there.
We need to understand the world we live in. We require news with critical points of view, thorough analysis, and social commitment. This information is vital to think, to understand, and to change. The world demands a new perspective. telesurtv.net/English. Wherever the news, you'll be there.
After launching cruise missiles from the Caspian Sea on Tuesday, the Syrian army and pro-regime forces launched a major ground operation in the Hama province. Backed by air support from Russian jets, the massive military offensive was a bid to take back towns and villages under siege by the Daesh group. The Ministry of Defense said that the Russian airstrikes have destroyed a number of vital Daesh targets. However, the U.S. State Department says that Russia's strikes have mostly targeted the Syrian opposition. For Human Rights said at least 6 people were killed, including 1 child, in suspected Russian airstrikes in Idlib. NATO is ready to defend all of their allies against all threats. Now, this is according to Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. Stoltenberg said defense ministers had decided to boost response forces so they could deploy troops very rapidly. This decision comes after NATO member Turkey complained that Russian planes violated their airspace on Saturday. NATO wants to avoid an international escalation of the conflict in Syria and says Russia's involvement is unhelpful. In what seems to be an attempt to discourage refugees, the governments of the European Union are set to step up deportations of who they class as illegal immigrants. The bloc has been struggling to cope with the flux of refugees from war-torn Syria. The UN interior ministers are meeting in Luxembourg and will reportedly decide that the deportees will be persons who have failed to win asylum. They are also expected to back the detention of those who may abscond before expulsion and exert more pressure on poor states in Africa and others, including through aid budgets. They hope that this will make the respective countries accept the return of citizens who were refused entry into Europe. After the U.S. bombing of a hospital of Doctors Without Borders in Kunduz, Afghanistan social activists made their voices heard, demanding compensation for the victims and their families. Bianca Perez now with more from Washington.
Social activist organizations raised their voices in protest of the bombing of a hospital in Kunduz, Afghanistan, saying that it was a war crime. The groups performed a die-in to commemorate the 22 lives lost and the 37 people wounded during the attack. Organizations demand that a thorough investigation performed by an independent entity is necessary to assure true transparency.
We're here to echo the call by Doctors Without Borders for an independent investigation, but we also are calling for compensation for the victims' families, a pledge to make sure that we take care of the healthcare needs of the wounded, and also that we figure out how to rebuild that hospital.
The White House, on their part, announced an apology made by President Obama to Doctors Without Borders as well as the government of Afghanistan. They declared that a thorough investigation will be conducted by the Department of Defense to determine all details of the attack.
President Obama spoke by telephone with Doctors Without Borders International President Dr. Joanne Liu to apologize and express his condolences for the MSF staff and patients who were killed and injured when a U.S. military airstrike mistakenly struck an MSF field hospital in Kunduz, Afghanistan over the weekend.
Army General John Campbell declared Tuesday before Congress that the bombing was a mistake. He also noted that President Obama's plan to only leave 1,000 soldiers in Afghanistan by the end of 2016 was a major error. However, citizens of the United States disagree, citing that they have not seen much improvement in the past 14 years.
I do believe that the troops should come home. I don't think what's going on right there really justifies all this loss of human life.
I don't think anything's happened. I don't even think it's improved, actually. I think it's gotten worse.
Prior to President Obama's apology to Doctors Without Borders, the first reaction from military authorities stated that the attack was requested by the Afghan military force, before recognizing that it had been a mistake. Bianca Perez, Telesur, Washington, D.C.
In Yemen now, the Saudi-led coalition has attacked civilians for the third time in recent weeks. On this occasion, they killed at least 30 people at a wedding party in a southwestern village. Some 130 civilians were also killed at another wedding last week. In total, the Saudi-led airstrikes have left over 2,300 civilians dead since the beginning of their operations on March 26. Over 14,000 have been injured. And clashes continue between Palestinians and the Israeli population, while reports of another wave of stabbings have surfaced. An Israeli student was stabbed and critically wounded in Jerusalem, and another person was stabbed in Tel Aviv. The situation is feared to be escalating as 4 Israelis were also killed in stabbings and a drive-by shooting in the occupied West Bank this past week alone. At least 5 Palestinians have been shot dead and scores more were injured during clashes with security services, 10 of them by live ammunition. More now from our correspondent in Palestine, Noor Harazin.
As the Palestinian residents here in the Gaza Strip are fearing the approach of the season of winter because over 100,000 of them are still displaced, living in shelters after Israel destroyed their homes last year. The situation is escalating in the West Bank for the 8th day in a row. Palestinian medical sources reported that there is over 20 injuries only today in different cities around the West Bank and Ramallah and East Jerusalem. The Israeli media reported that there is 4 Palestinians who attacked Israeli settlers in different areas like Tel Aviv and also Jerusalem.
After their annual meetings held this year in Peru, the IMF says they, along with the World Bank, expect recovery and positive growth for the Western Hemisphere. According to the latest published IMF report, regional growth elsewhere will turn slightly negative. The report also indicates a protracted slowdown in emerging markets, including a transition to slower growth in China and weaker performance in oil exporters, is a factor behind slower global growth. FIFA President Sepp Blatter and European soccer chief Michel Platini have been provisionally suspended for 90 days from all football activities on a national and international level. Now, FIFA's Ethics Committee made the announcement earlier this Thursday in Switzerland, where they also said that FIFA presidential candidate Chung Mong-jun of South Korea has been banned for years and fined over $100,000. In addition, the organization's Secretary General Jerome Valkne has been banned for 90 days. FIFA's interim president will be Issa Hayantou, who is the head of African soccer. Picasso, as seen by contemporary artists. An exhibition in Paris called Picasso Mania shows some 400 works of 75 international artists inspired by the Spaniard. The 1/3 of the paintings displayed at the Grand Palais belong to the master himself. Others come from artists influenced by him, like Roy Lichtenstein, Andy Warhol, and a few African artists. A whole room is dedicated to Picasso's painting, one of Picasso's paintings. As we're covering on this afternoon here from Caracas, with plenty more on all those stories and plenty others at our website, telesurtv.net/English. For Telesur English, I'm Cody Weddle. Have a great day.